Anyway, okay, we are in the section on singing. Last week we read the four passages that you have in your booklet, and we were noting some things about them. Now we're going to go back and just touch on what our writer actually was talking about in these passages. The main two, one in the Ephesians and one in Colossians, that gives us a little instruction about singing. I think one of the most striking things in the New Testament is very little is said. We know they sang, even with Jesus at the Last Supper. It says when they left, they sang a hymn. So obviously, he sang. And in the depictions that we have in Scripture, we see that the congregation gathered on the first day of the week, and singing was a part of that. It's also interesting that in Acts chapter 2, singing is not mentioned as part of their worship service, but it's mentioned elsewhere. And as we look at it, I would suggest that it's on purpose that we only have a limited amount of information. Singing is supposed to be done a certain way. The passages illustrate that. And from my impression of the New Testament, they didn't need to say anything else about it. So they said what they needed to say and tried to get across the information they wanted us to know, and then they were silent. There are certain things in the four passages that define for us the parameters of what singing is for. And I would suggest that our world of Christianity has decided that none of them apply. I'm going to not, as I have been saying, not get up on a soapbox about instrumental music, but it seems like I'm not able to avoid it. So we will continue to try to avoid that because we're talking about enhancing our own singing, not necessarily why we believe a cappella is biblically correct. Anyway, someone said, well, then you're going to have to do a lesson on that. And so I'm putting something together because I think that oftentimes we think it's just a what shall we say, you can pick it or not type of attitude toward how we sing. And I believe there's biblical reasons why that's not the case. But anyway, we're going to look at enhancing our singing a little further and some things that we ought to know. So the rest of our lesson just tries to do that for us. And we're going to start right here where it says, teach and admonish one another. The purpose of singing is multifolded. Um, and what I find again interesting is one of the things that does not or is not really prevalent in what is said is how I feel about it. That seems to be a secondary thought altogether in the passages that we're looking at. Obviously, we have feelings about singing, and we should. But at the same time, I find it striking that there is so limited information about those emotions pertaining how we sing. Yet, to have a singing service that is so undesirable, it does not help our mood in any measure. You know, it's always been funny to me as a preacher, the song leaders in the churches of Christ always pick their own songs, unless you live in England and somebody else picks them for you. But here in the United States, we always let the song leader pick their own songs, which is fine. Sometimes the preacher will say, well, can you do this one? And that's fine too. Um, but the mood of the congregation can strikingly be different before the sermon, depending on the song. I mean, if you're going to sing before Jehovah's awful throne, before we have the sermon, then everybody's already depressed before we get to whatever the preacher's going to say. Where if you sing and be happy, then of course the attitude of the congregation is also strikingly different. I've also found as a preacher, and not that I insist on it one way or the other, but I've also found that if we stand for that song before the preaching, everybody's a whole lot happier through the sermon because they've been sitting a long time. And so very often that will occur, but when it doesn't, there's a different mood in the congregation. There's also the idea of when we get to the invitation song, how many verses of Just As I Am can we sing? Seems to be the indication for some. You know, originally there are 28 verses to Just As I Am. Our songbook only has 8. But we can stretch this thing out for a long time. I always figured that if you're not coming forward in the first 2 verses, then forget it. I'm going back there. I mean, there's no reason to belabor the issue. Is it going to make you decide differently if we sing 12 verses or not? Now, in the old days, they did a little differently. As they sang Just As I Am, they stop and say, and I'm talking about you. And then we'll sing the next verse. Well, you're not coming forward yet. And then we'll sing the third verse. And then I've even heard preachers say, we're going to sing all of them until you come forward. Now, that old boy's going to come forward because he's sick of it. He says, I'm done. I'm going to come forward, and whatever you want to say is fine, but at least we're out of here. Totally unbiblical, and of course, in every relation, not the proper way to handle whether it be the invitation or singing. I wish that we would at least spend some time, and I do believe our song leaders try very hard to do this. I'm not criticizing them in the least, but that we should spend some time as song leaders, if we're leading songs, deciding what we're going to sing that morning and pay a little bit of attention to what is being offered to the congregation. And all of this comes into play with some of the things we're going to look at. Our singing is not just directed toward God. Certainly many songs are, but many songs are rightly directed to each other. We're going to look at the passages. These, because many songs are designed to teach one another, teaching and admonishing us to live properly, to enjoy the blessing of the Christian life. It might even be said that congregational singing is actually congregational teaching. Do not our brethren deserve the best encouragement we can offer? Now, this is kind of important in its own right. We have our two verses. I've underlined the pertinent parts of these verses that we've already read. The first section is admonish one another in all wisdom. The other says address one another in psalms and hymns. And up there in verse 16 of Colossians 3, it uses the word teaching. So it is interesting that the purpose in Scripture for singing is multifolded. One, yes, we sing to God, and we're worshiping to God. That's true. But obviously these passages suggest that there is something more to it. That singing and the words thereof are intended to teach us something, and songs often do. They have a theme of some kind or another. Now, to get up on my little soapbox that I'm not going to get on, if it doesn't have teaching involved in it in some way specific, that is actually instructing us, then I would venture to say the song is not appropriate. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be complicated. It's not that that some of the newer songs, as we call them, even though most of them aren't new anymore, may not be complicated. They may be enjoyable for the younger because they're a little more in the style of our era that we live in instead of 1714. And that's all fine. But when it is only a la, 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 there's no teaching. There's no admonishing. It's all just an emotional thing then. And unfortunately, that's what instruments do almost across the board, is they are intended for one thing. They are intended to make us emotional in some way or another. And so I would suggest that it can't fit this passage. It just does not fit into this picture of teaching and admonishing one another to be the kind of Christian we should be. So I would be critical of that kind of an angle when it comes to how we have our hymns presented, or however, whatever you're calling them. They don't even call them hymns anymore in a lot of what the denominational world is doing. So we have this admonishing and teaching. If you use the word admonish, we don't use the word admonishment. What comes to mind? Admonish. Okay, sometimes it is a form of scolding. It's not always scolding, but it can be a kind of terminology. When we use Scripture or I preach, I hear people say, well, I preached a sermon here a while back. It was a bit fire and brimstone-ish. And I had several people say, good sermon, but you stepped all over me. So you're being admonished. And it's, of course, the Scripture that does the admonishing. You can't help but be admonished when the Scripture says, put off, and then you got this list of all this stuff, that we're supposed to get rid of. And of course, by the nature of that, we're admonished or reproached in some way or another. But it has another meaning. It can be an encouragement. It can be a lifting tone or a lifting voice. It may do both. On the one hand, it may influence us in a negative sense because it reproves us. But if we correct our lives, then it lifts us. Then it puts us in a better place for God. And this is admonishing, if you will. So songs are intentionally to do that. Scripture does that. And so they have that in common as far as teaching is concerned. Very few passages of Scripture that we can use anywhere that don't do a bit of both in one way or another. If we're doing what we're supposed to be doing that the passage says, then it doesn't affect us that way. But if we're not, then of course it admonishes us to be better than we are in some way or another. And all of us have the same problem. We find ourselves lacking biblically, and so it does exactly what it's intended to do. Teaching, of course, is just very simple. It is a message that gives you information that you can actually do something with, that has a value to your life in some way or another. So when we teach via hymn, does it have a value in our life? I would even suggest that some of our old hymns at one time had a value that may no longer have a value. If you have never brought in a sheave in your life or worked that way, bringing in the sheaves is a beautiful song if you understand what it means. And it is, of course, in its own right, most of us do understand, I think, to some extent what it means. So I'm not suggesting it's unbiblical. But at the same time, if we are younger, even than most of us in here are, then they have no clue what a sheave even was. You know, I heard one fellow say, "Why are we shearing sheep?" I mean, they didn't have any, shearing. I mean, they had no idea, no clue whatsoever what the song was even trying to talk about. In such a realm, I would venture to say that it's just simply found itself outdated. I mean, it's just beyond our date. And we still sing it because we love the song in many cases, and we have every pleasure to do so. But at the same time, there may come a day when such songs have no meaning whatsoever. And so, what's the point? You know, and in that case, it may well become unscriptural at some point where it can no longer be used the way God intended it to be used. So that's also a problem that often presents itself in our enjoyment of hymns. To be filled and enriched, singing can be a means to being filled with the Spirit. Paul charged the Ephesians to be filled with the Spirit. He exclaimed, how? By singing and making melody in one's heart to the Lord. Singing can be a means to being enriched